The sun spread its fire across the endless sky, pouring gold and red light over a land that had seen more silence than laughter. Dust drifted in the air like old memories, clinging to broken fences and forgotten corners of a once proud ranch. Beneath that same sky, a girl struggled against ropes that cut deeper than flesh. They carved into her very spirit. Mary was only 17, yet her shoulders carried years of sorrow. Her stepfather's cruelty pressed down on her like an iron shackle, his greed for the ranch twisting into violence that left her bruised, weary, and desperate. Her lips were cracked, her voice raw, but still she whispered prayers into the empty wind, fragile words rising like smoke. No answer came. Only the restless sway of dry grass and the buzz of cicadas that seemed to mock her helplessness. She thought often of her mother, of how this land once bloomed with laughter, of how the kitchen windows once glowed with the warmth of fresh bread. But those memories now felt like dreams from another lifetime, slipping further away each time her stepfather's shadow stretched across her path. Every day seemed to steal more of her childhood, and still she fought to believe that somewhere in the wide, merciless West, someone might hear her, someone might care. The ache in her chest grew heavier with every heartbeat, yet inside that ache glimmered a tiny flame, the stubborn will not to surrender, not to let cruelty swallow her whole. Her wrists burned against the coarse rope, but she lifted her chin, refusing to bow to despair. The world may have been empty, the horizon endless, but sometimes, even in the harshest deserts, mercy arrives when you least expect it, and while Mary did not yet know it, the sound of hooves would soon change the course of her life. A stranger's path was drawing closer, carried on leather reins and steady breath, a man whose presence would be both a shield and a storm. In that coming moment, her story would no longer belong only to pain. It would stretch into healing, into courage, into love. For you listening now, let this beginning remind you that even in the loneliest valleys of your own heart, light has a way of finding the cracks. Sometimes it comes gently, sometimes it rides in with dust and thunder, but it comes. If this story touches a quiet part of your soul, stay with me. Like this moment, comment with your thoughts, and subscribe so we can walk together through every chapter. Your presence here is part of the healing thread we weave across stories, across time. And as Mary's breath quivered against the ropes and the echo of hooves grew louder on the horizon, the question remained: would this rider bring her salvation, or only another shadow to endure? The answer waited just beyond the dust, where fate prepared to intertwine two broken paths into one. The sound of hooves drew nearer, breaking through the heavy silence like a heartbeat returning to a weary body. Dust lifted in soft spirals as a tall figure rode into view, his frame upright, steady as the land itself. John Carter reined in his horse, his sharp gaze scanning the horizon before settling on the frail form bound against the wooden fence. What he saw froze him. A young woman, skin bruised, lips trembling, but eyes burning with something fierce beneath the tears. It wasn't just suffering he recognized. It was the strength of a soul still refusing to die. John slid down from his saddle, boots pressing firm against the dry earth. He moved with the cautious grace of a man who had lived too long in dangerous places, yet his voice, when it came, was low, almost tender. "Easy now," he said, though the words were less for her ears than for the trembling in her spirit. The knife he drew glinted under the sun, its edge slicing against the ropes that had stolen her freedom. Each strand gave way with a snap, like chains breaking under the weight of justice. Mary gasped as blood returned to her swollen hands, the sting sharp, yet strangely comforting. She wanted to speak, but her throat was dry, her voice trapped behind all the silence she had been forced to keep. John's steady hand caught her when her knees buckled, guiding her close against the worn leather of his vest. His touch was rough with calluses, yet careful, a strange mix of strength and gentleness that made her heart stutter with something unfamiliar. Safety. For so long, safety had been a forgotten word. He looked into her face, dirt-streaked and tear-stained, and in her eyes he saw both terror and a fragile spark of hope. It stirred something inside him he thought long buried. He had seen violence before, seen greed twist men into monsters, but here was innocence robbed and still clinging to the thread of survival. No man with honor could ride past and leave her behind. In that moment, John made a silent vow. Whatever storm came after this, he would stand between it and her. Mary leaned against him, her body trembling like a foal learning its first steps. His words settled into her chest like a healing salve. "You're safe now. I've got you." Her lips parted, a whisper slipping out, brittle but certain. "It was him, my stepfather. He wants the ranch. He won't stop." John's jaw tightened, his eyes darkening as if fire burned behind them. He had known men like Hank before, men who believed power came from cruelty, who turned family into prey. But when he looked back at Mary, he softened. "Listen to me. You're not alone anymore. That land is yours, and no man has the right to steal it from you, not while I'm here." Her tears fell, not from weakness, but from the relief of finally hearing someone speak the truth she had been too afraid to hold on to. Gratitude bloomed within her chest, fragile but real, and she let herself believe, if only for a moment, that maybe her story was not yet over. John lifted her gently onto his horse, then swung up behind her, his presence firm and protective. Together they rode away from the fence that had been her prison, the hooves carrying them toward a house where shadows still lingered, but where healing had begun. The sun dipped lower, painting the sky in copper and rose. Mary sat wrapped in a blanket later that evening, staring into the fire that crackled softly. John leaned near the doorway, eyes alert, shoulders rigid. He knew Hank's kind. They never walked away after being denied. The silence outside was thick, restless, waiting. And in that silence, Mary found herself whispering a vow inside her heart, a vow born from the warmth of the man beside her. She would no longer surrender to fear. And just as the flames painted hope across her face, the night broke with the sound of boots on gravel and the slow groan of the ranch gate opening. Shadows stirred once more, carrying with them the rage of a man who refused to lose. The fight was not yet over. It was only beginning. The night pressed close around the ranch, the stars hidden behind a veil of restless clouds. Mary sat rigid near the fire, her blanket pulled tightly around her shoulders, the warmth doing little to ease the chill that had taken root deep within her chest. John's silhouette stood at the door, steady as a wall, his hand resting lightly near the pistol on his hip. He had not spoken for some time, but his silence carried weight, as though he knew what was coming and was ready to face it. The air smelled of smoke, earth, and something darker. an omen that the shadow of her stepfather had not yet lifted. The creak of the gate broke through the quiet. The heavy rhythm of boots on gravel followed, slow and deliberate, each step echoing like a hammer striking her fear. Mary's heart thudded against her ribs, her breath shallow. John did not flinch. His jaw hardened, his eyes sharp. Then a voice rang out across the night, ragged and venomous, a voice Mary knew too well. "You can't hide her from me, old man. That ranch is mine, and so is everything on it." Mary's hands tightened on the blanket, her knuckles white. For so long his words had been her chains. Yet tonight, with John standing firm, she felt something shift. Her legs trembled as she rose, each step a battle against the fear that had lived in her bones for years. She stood behind John at first, then stepped forward, her voice shaking but clear, breaking through the night like a fragile hymn. "You're lying. Mama left it to me. You'll never take it. Not again." The door burst open, the wood shuddering against its hinges. Hank stormed in, his eyes bloodshot with rage, his fists curled like weapons. He lunged, his fury wild, but John was already there, a barrier of unyielding strength. Their bodies collided, fists striking, boots scraping against the wooden floor. The lanterns swung overhead, shadows dancing in frantic rhythm as the two men clashed. Mary pressed into the corner, her heart racing, yet she did not close her eyes. She forced herself to watch, to witness the battle for her freedom. The fight was raw, fierce. John's years of hardship etched into every movement, Hank's greed driving him with reckless fury. A table overturned, crashing into the floor, while the fire in the hearth leapt higher, casting wild light across the struggle. Hank's fists found John's jaw, but John only staggered before striking back, each blow fueled not just by strength, but by the unspoken promise he had made to Mary. She clutched the blanket tighter, her lips trembling, whispering silent prayers that this storm would finally break. And then, through the chaos, something awakened within her. She was no longer the helpless girl bound to a fence, waiting to be rescued. She was a daughter defending her mother's memory, a young woman reclaiming the dignity stolen from her. Her trembling steadied, her eyes lit with a fire that fear could no longer quench. She stepped forward when Hank crashed against the floor, John pinning him with iron strength. Hank struggled, snarling, his breath reeking of liquor and rage, but John pressed him down, his voice sharp as steel. "Your time's up. You're finished here." Mary's legs shook, but she did not falter. She stood above the man who had stolen her childhood, her voice rising from a place deeper than pain, stronger than despair. "You will answer for what you've done. Not to me, not to him, but to the law." Her words cut through the room like a verdict, heavier than any fist. For the first time, Hank's eyes flickered, not with rage, but with fear. Because even in the lawless corners of the West, a man could not run forever from justice. The silence that followed was thick, broken only by Hank's ragged breath and the crackle of fire. John's grip held him firm, but his eyes turned to Mary, and in that moment he saw her not as a broken girl, but as someone rising, forged by suffering into quiet strength. The healing had already begun, not with gentle words or comfort, but with the act of standing tall against the storm. As dawn crept slowly over the horizon, the lawmen arrived, their horses casting long shadows in the early light. Hank was dragged away in chains, his curses fading into the distance. The ranch, once soaked in fear, breathed easier. Mary stood at the doorway, the sun painting her face in gold, her body weary but her spirit unbroken. For the first time in years she felt the weight lift, replaced by a fragile yet steady hope. John stayed beside her, silent, his presence more reassuring than any promise. She glanced at him, gratitude swelling in her chest, gratitude that went beyond words, that felt like the beginning of something neither of them had expected. She knew the fight was not over. Life on the ranch would demand more strength, more courage. But she also knew she was no longer alone. And with that truth warming her heart, she stepped into the light of morning, ready to face what waited beyond. The land stretched wide, the sky endless, yet the air felt different now, lighter, healing, and somewhere in that horizon Mary felt the quiet stir of love, not sudden, not rushed, but patient, like seeds waiting for rain. The story was not finished. It was only unfolding, each chapter carrying her further from fear and closer to the life she was meant to claim. The sun had only begun its climb when the dust of Hank's capture settled, leaving the ranch strangely quiet. Mary stood on the porch, her hands resting on the rail as if holding on to the wood could steady the storm still swirling inside her. Behind her, the land stretched endlessly, the fences in need of mending, the barns weathered, the fields aching for work. It should have felt overwhelming, but instead there was a fragile calm, like the hush after thunder when the world breathes again. She inhaled deeply, and though fear lingered at the edges, something warmer pushed through, the healing scent of freedom. John came out from the shadows of the barn, his shirt still marked with dust and the bruise of battle. He moved with the weary steadiness of a man who had fought too many fights, yet his eyes found hers with quiet reassurance. He carried a bucket of water in one hand and bread in the other, simple offerings, yet Mary felt her throat tighten at the thoughtfulness. No one had cared for her needs in so long that even these small acts pressed tears against her lashes. She blinked them away, unwilling to appear weak, but John noticed and said nothing. His silence was a gift, allowing her to stand with dignity. Later that morning, he led her gently into the corral. The horse, a strong chestnut with dark eyes, pawed the ground nervously, as if sensing her hesitation. Mary stiffened, her body recalling the sting of being dragged, tied and bound. Yet John's hand was there on her shoulder, steady, grounding. "She won't hurt you," he said softly, though his tone carried no demand, only patience. He showed her how to hold the reins, how to sit with balance. His touch corrected her posture, firm yet careful, and for the first time she felt the thrill of control as the horse shifted beneath her. She was no longer a captive. She was learning to guide her own path. The days unfolded with the rhythm of healing. John taught her how to fire a rifle, not with cruelty, but with reverence, as though each shot was less about violence and more about claiming strength. At night they sat by the fire, the crackle filling the spaces where words were unnecessary. She listened to the steady cadence of his breathing, felt the weight of his presence guarding the silence, and her chest eased. Fear still haunted her dreams, but when she woke trembling, the sight of John near the doorway, eyes alert and unwavering, was enough to quiet the storm. Mary's spirit, once cracked and fragile, began to mend like the ranch itself. She repaired fences with calloused hands, planted seeds with determination, and found joy in the small victories. A repaired gate swinging freely, a patch of earth ready for growth. Each act stitched her closer to the land her mother had loved, the land she had nearly lost. John's quiet encouragement was always there, like a thread woven through every step. He didn't shield her from the work. Instead, he stood beside her, sharing it. And in the quiet companionship, something unspoken grew. Their bond deepened not through grand gestures, but through the simple, steady rhythm of survival. He brought her coffee in the mornings, strong and bitter, and she smiled at the thought of him watching her taste it for the first time. She sewed a patch into his worn shirt, her fingers brushing the fabric where his heart beat beneath. Neither spoke of love, yet it was there in the warmth of shared silence, in the way his hand lingered when passing her tools, in the way her eyes sought his in the dim light of evening. It was not the fiery love of stories whispered in town. It was quieter, stronger, built on trust and the gentle healing of wounded souls. Still, shadows remained. Some nights Mary stood at the fence, staring into the dark fields, wondering if Hank's memory would ever leave her. John would come, silent as always, and simply stand beside her, his presence a shield stronger than words. Once, when her hands trembled from the memories, he took them into his rough palms and pressed them firm until her trembling eased. "Scars aren't weakness," he murmured, his voice low, almost lost to the wind. "They're proof you endured." She carried those words into her heart like a talisman, a truth she could lean on when the weight of the past tried to crush her. The seasons shifted. Grass grew tall again in the fields, birds sang at dawn, and the air filled with life where silence had once reigned. Mary walked the land with her head high, her eyes bright, her spirit no longer a prisoner of fear. The ranch was not just her inheritance, it was her rebirth. And John remained, not as a savior who carried her burden, but as a companion who walked with her through it. It was in the slow unfolding of these days that Mary realized what her heart had quietly known. Love had taken root, not rushed, not fragile, but deep and enduring, like the roots of an old oak tree. She saw it in John's smile when he thought she wasn't looking, in the way his laughter softened when she stumbled and tried again, in the tenderness that flickered beneath his rugged exterior. And though she did not yet speak the words, she carried them with her, a promise for the chapters yet to come. And so the ranch began to thrive, not just with crops and cattle, but with healing, with the slow, steady rhythm of two lives intertwining. Love did not arrive like a storm. It came like the dawn, gentle, patient, inevitable. And in that warmth, Mary began to believe that even after the cruelest of nights, the heart can bloom again. But as she looked across the horizon, she knew the West was never without its trials. Peace was fragile, and justice in those lands was often tested. Though Hank was gone, the echoes of his cruelty lingered, and Mary wondered what new challenges the world might place in their path. Yet she no longer feared the question. With John at her side, she felt ready to face whatever shadows might rise again. The summer sun spilled across the fields, soaking the land in light that seemed almost forgiving after so many years of shadow. Mary stood at the edge of the corral, her hair lifted by the breeze, her hands resting against the smooth rail. The ranch was breathing again. Cattle grazed in the distance, fences stood straighter each week, and the earth yielded small patches of green where once there had only been dust. Yet it wasn't just the land that was mending. It was her heart, learning to stretch and grow after having been caged for so long. John's presence had become part of her days in ways she hadn't realized until she tried to imagine the ranch without him. His boots by the door, the sound of his horse before dawn, the deep timbre of his voice carried easily across the yard when he called out directions. He moved with quiet certainty, fixing what was broken with a patience that steadied her more than he would ever know. And though he rarely spoke of his own past, there was a gentleness beneath the rugged lines of his face, a gentleness that told her he had known his share of storms. One evening, as the sun melted into the horizon and painted the sky in hues of rose and amber, John handed her a rifle. His expression was steady, his tone calm. "You should know how to protect yourself," he said. Mary's fingers trembled as they wrapped around the wood, memories flashing of nights when she had been powerless. But John stood close, his hand brushing hers to adjust her grip, his warmth grounding her. "Breathe," he whispered, not just about the shot, but about life itself. She exhaled, pulled the trigger, and the sound cracked across the open fields. The target splintered, and for the first time she felt the weight of fear slip just a little further from her shoulders. Later that night, she sat by the fire, the blanket drawn loosely around her. John leaned against the wall nearby, the firelight carving shadows along his jaw. Silence stretched between them, not heavy but comforting, filled with the crackle of flames and the soft night wind drifting through the cracks in the wood. Mary glanced at him, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Why do you stay?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he poured another cup of coffee, handed it to her, and sat down across from her. His eyes met hers, steady and unflinching, because no one deserves to carry such battles alone. Those words settled deep inside her, warm and healing. For years she had been told she was worthless, a burden, a girl unfit to stand on her own land. But here was a man who saw her not as weakness, but as someone worth standing beside. Gratitude welled in her chest, tangled with something softer, something she did not yet dare to name. Still, it lingered in the way she watched him, in the way her heart steadied whenever he was near. The days rolled forward. Mary learned to ride with confidence, her laughter echoing against the hills when the horse galloped under the wide blue sky. She repaired broken boards with her own hands, proud of the strength in her arms, proud that she could shape her home into something whole again. John never overshadowed her efforts. He guided when needed, stepped back when she found her rhythm, and always let her victories be hers. Each act of growth, each small triumph, stitched her wounds into scars that no longer felt like shame, but like proof of survival. Still, not every night was easy. Shadows of her stepfather's cruelty visited her dreams, leaving her breathless and shaking. On those nights, John never pressed her with questions. He would sit quietly by the fire, speaking little, sometimes humming a tune under his breath until her trembling eased. His presence was enough, like the calm of rain after drought, a quiet healing that words could never carry. And with each passing season, she began to believe more deeply in the possibility of peace. One afternoon, after long hours mending the fences, Mary collapsed into the grass, her body aching but her spirit soaring. John joined her, lowering himself slowly, stretching out beside her in the golden light. They lay in silence, staring at the sky where clouds drifted lazily, the world vast, yet strangely intimate. She turned her head, caught the curve of his mouth, the tired lines of his face, and felt the words press at her lips, words she wasn't yet ready to release. Instead, she let her hand brush against his, tentative, soft. His fingers curled around hers without hesitation, grounding her in that fragile, beautiful moment. Their bond was no longer just survival. It had become a quiet devotion, born of shared labor and unspoken trust. And though neither spoke of love, it was there, in every glance, every touch, every silence that did not need filling. It was in the way John looked at her, as if she were more than the scars she carried, as if she were strength itself. And it was in the way Mary began to see not only the man who had saved her, but the man who had chosen to stay, to build, to heal beside her. The ranch, once the stage of her torment, was becoming the soil where hope grew again. And with every dawn that painted the sky, Mary felt herself stepping further away from the girl who had once been bound and helpless, and closer to the woman who could stand tall, unbroken. Yet in her heart she knew the path ahead still held trials, for the West never stayed quiet for long, but she no longer feared the horizon. With John by her side, the unknown no longer seemed like darkness. It seemed like the promise of more days to endure, to grow, and perhaps, finally, to love without fear. The seasons turned gently, as if the land itself wished to cradle Mary's wounds into healing. Autumn painted the fields in amber and rust, and though the ranch was still worn with scars of neglect, it carried the pulse of life again. Mary moved through her days with steadier steps, her hands no longer trembling when she held reins, her voice no longer faltering when she gave direction to the men who came to trade. The ranch, once stolen by fear, now began to reflect her strength, an echo of her mother's spirit living through her. John was always there, not hovering but steady, a presence that had become as natural as the wind sweeping the grasslands. He worked alongside her with quiet endurance, mending fences, breaking wild horses, hauling water from the well. Yet beyond the chores, there was an intimacy in the silence they shared. It was in the way his eyes softened when they rested on her, in the way she carried a quiet calm whenever his shadow stretched near. Love had not rushed in with declarations or hurried passion. It had bloomed slowly, like wildflowers pushing through the cracks of a long, barren earth. One evening, as the sky faded into velvet blue, Mary stood at the porch with a shawl wrapped around her shoulders. The stars began to pierce through the dark, sharp and endless, reminding her of how small and fragile she once felt. John joined her without a word, his arm brushing lightly against hers as they gazed out together. The silence stretched, warm and unbroken, until she spoke softly, her words carrying more weight than the cool night air. "I used to think I'd never be free of him. That no matter what happened, I'd always belong to the shadow he left behind." John turned his head, his profile etched by the faint glow of the lantern. He didn't speak immediately, only let the truth of her confession hang in the air before he answered. "Shadows don't last, Mary. Not when you walk into the light." He glanced at her then, eyes steady, voice low but fierce with conviction. "And you've been walking into it every day since I met you." His words sank deep, a balm against the ache that still lived in her chest. She blinked back tears, not from sorrow, but from the release of carrying her pain too long in silence. The next morning, she rose before dawn and stepped into the fields, watching the horizon burn with the first light. her breath misted in the chill, her heart pounding with a strange mixture of fear and joy. She realized that every step forward she had taken was not only survival, it was reclamation. This ranch, this life, was hers again, not as a prisoner of grief, but as a woman growing stronger each day. And John, though he had offered her safety, had also given her something deeper, the courage to believe she was worth protecting, worth loving. Days passed in a rhythm both ordinary and profound. She laughed more often, small bursts of sound that startled her at first, as though joy were a language she had forgotten. John would look up from his work whenever she laughed, his lips tugging into a smile he never tried to hide. There was warmth between them, slow burning, unspoken, but alive in every glance and touch. Sometimes, while they worked side by side, her hand would brush against his, and though neither drew attention to it, the world seemed to pause in that tender contact. One evening, rain swept across the plains, drumming against the roof in steady rhythm. Mary sat near the fire, her hair damp, her cheeks flushed from the cold. John entered, carrying wood, the rain dripping from his hat and shoulders. She laughed softly, a sound wrapped in comfort, and hurried to take the load from him. Their hands met on the bundle, fingers tangling for a heartbeat too long. Neither pulled away. For a moment the storm outside faded, replaced by the quiet storm that brewed between them, fierce yet healing. As the months unfolded, Mary noticed something shifting within her heart. The fear that once chained her at every sound of footsteps in the dark had loosened, replaced by trust, and trust had deepened into something she dared to call love, though she had not yet given it voice. It lived in the way she sought his face in a crowd, in the way her heart steadied at his nearness, in the way she dreamed now not of escape, but of future. Still, love born from brokenness carried its own fragility. She wondered if John felt it too, if he saw her not just as someone to protect, but as someone he could hold without fear. One night, as they stood together in the barn, lantern light flickering against the wooden beams, she found herself speaking words that trembled on her lips. "Do you ever think of what comes next?" He paused in his work, turned to her slowly, and though his answer was simple, it was enough to make her heart surge. Every day. The seasons stretched on, and with each passing dawn, Mary grew more certain that her life was not just returning, it was blooming anew. The ranch thrived, her spirit healed, and beside her stood the man who had walked through the fire with her. Though neither had spoken their love aloud, it was there, undeniable, a quiet force binding them. And as she looked toward the horizon, glowing with the promise of tomorrow, she knew the hardest part of her journey was behind her. Yet in the West, peace was never permanent. Whispers of unrest rode on the wind, and Mary sensed that the trials ahead would test not only her strength, but the bond she and John had forged. Still, she no longer trembled at the thought. Whatever storm awaited, she was ready to meet it, because love, steady and healing, had finally taken root in her life, and with John by her side, she could face even the wildest horizon. Winter swept quietly across the plains, laying its pale veil over the ranch, softening the earth and silencing the restless winds. Snow gathered along the fence posts, sparkling under the early light, and the world seemed hushed, as though the land itself had paused to breathe. For Mary, the cold no longer carried only loneliness. Wrapped in her shawl, she walked the grounds with purpose, her steps steady, her spirit no longer fragile. Each plume of breath that rose from her lips felt like proof of survival. Each task completed another stitch mending the wounds of her past. John remained a constant presence through the season, his strength woven into every corner of the ranch. He chopped wood in the mornings, his figure broad and sure against the frost, his breath rising in steady clouds. Mary often watched him through the window while she kneaded bread, her hands dusted with flour, her heart tugged by the sight of him working without complaint. There was a steadiness in him she had grown to lean on, not as a crutch, but as an anchor. It soothed her, this quiet certainty, like a healing balm poured into the cracks of her life. Their companionship deepened in the long evenings, when the fire glowed warm and the storm winds rattled against the shutters. They spoke little of the past, choosing instead to share small stories of the day. The stubborn mule that refused to move, the joy of a calf born healthy, the taste of coffee too strong or too weak. These simple exchanges were more than idle words. They were threads weaving them closer together. Every smile, every laugh, every glance lingered in the air, a gentle promise that love was blooming quietly in the spaces between them. Mary often found herself reflecting on how far she had come. The girl once bound to the fence, trembling with despair, now stood tall, unafraid to meet the gaze of strangers in town. She carried herself with dignity, her eyes bright with resilience. She no longer flinched at every sudden noise, no longer feared the night. Healing had not erased the scars, but it had given them meaning. They were no longer marks of suffering, but of survival. John had given her the space to become strong, and in return she had begun to believe she could be more than her pain. One evening, after a day of mending fences together, they sat on the porch as twilight bled across the horizon. The air was sharp with cold, but Mary felt warmth where her shoulder brushed against his. She tilted her head, studying the lines of his face, the silver threaded in his hair, the weariness of a man who had carried too many burdens. And yet, in his eyes, she found something that softened the world, something steady, unwavering, quietly tender. Her hand, gloved against the chill, shifted until it rested over his. He did not move for a moment, as though caught in the stillness of the world around them. Then his fingers curled around hers, firm and protective, yet gentle, as though he feared she might pull away. She didn't. Instead, she let the silence speak, the steady rhythm of their joined hands echoing louder than any words could. In that touch was the truth of all they had endured. The storms weathered, the nights survived. The weeks that followed drew them closer still. When Mary's nightmares returned, John's presence calmed her before dawn. When John's old injuries ached with the cold, Mary brewed herbs her mother once taught her, her hands steady as she pressed the warm cloths against his skin. These quiet acts of care bound them in ways stronger than passion alone. They became the daily proof of love, patient and enduring. As winter began to loosen its hold, the ranch thrived under their combined strength. Mary managed the accounts, oversaw the workers, and found pride in every corner she reclaimed. John worked beside her, never taking her voice lightly, always letting her decisions carry weight. He didn't rescue her anymore because she no longer needed rescuing. Instead, he stood with her, equal and unwavering, a man who had chosen not just to save her once, but to walk the road of life alongside her. And though neither had yet spoken the word love, it existed in every glance, every small gesture, every breath shared between them. It lived in the warmth of their evenings, in the laughter that spilled softly into the air, in the healing rhythm of two lives intertwining. Mary felt it rising inside her like spring beneath the snow, patient but unstoppable. The land itself seemed to know it. Soon the frost would give way to blossoms, and the ranch, once marked by cruelty, would stand as a place of hope, of strength, of quiet devotion. And as Mary lifted her eyes toward the horizon, she knew the next chapter would not only belong to her survival, but to the love that had taken root, steady and healing, in the heart of her home. Spring came with its gentle chorus, washing the plains in shades of green that felt almost miraculous after the long hush of winter. The ranch, once broken and weary, now carried the pulse of life, fields shimmering with new grass, calves stumbling on uncertain legs, wildflowers nodding softly along the fence lines. The air itself felt different, warmer, infused with the kind of promise Mary had once thought she would never know again. She walked through the fields with her head high, her hair lifted by the soft wind, her hands brushing against the tall grass as though she were greeting an old friend returned from a long absence. John watched her from a distance, leaning against the corral, his expression unreadable, but his eyes following her with quiet pride. She had changed in ways that words could not capture. The girl he had first found bound and broken against the fence was gone. In her place stood a woman strong, steady, resilient, a woman who had endured cruelty and risen from it with fire in her heart. He had not given her that strength. It had always been within her, but he had been there to remind her that it mattered, that it could guide her forward. And though he rarely spoke of love, John knew now that every breath he took was tied to her. Their bond had become a steady rhythm of shared days. They worked side by side in the fields, laughter and quiet conversation mingling with the sound of hammer against wood or the low murmur of cattle. Evenings were spent by the fire, their silences no longer heavy, but filled with comfort. Sometimes Mary would read from the worn Bible her mother had left behind, her voice soft, the words carrying a kind of healing weight. John would listen, not because he was a man of Scripture, but because her voice made every verse sound like a promise of renewal. Love had not burst between them like a storm. It had rooted itself slowly, season after season, patient and enduring. Mary felt it in the way John's hand lingered when he passed her tools, in the way his gaze softened when she smiled, in the way he carried her burdens without ever making her feel weak. And John felt it in her laughter, in her growing confidence, in the way she stitched hope back into every corner of the ranch. Together they were weaving something neither had dared dream of before, a life where healing and love could live side by side. One evening, as the sun set the sky aflame with gold and crimson, John joined Mary on the porch. The land stretched out before them, wide and endless, yet it no longer felt lonely. Mary leaned against the railing, her hair touched with the last light of day, and turned to him. Her voice trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of truth. All my life I thought love was something fragile, something easily broken. But now I know it can be strong, stronger than pain, stronger than shadows. John's hand found hers, rough and calloused, yet tender. His eyes, steady and unflinching, met hers with a quiet certainty. Love isn't about never breaking, he said. It's about choosing to keep standing together, no matter what comes. His words were simple, But in them Mary felt the entire journey they had walked, the tears, the battles, the slow mending of wounds. And as the night deepened around them, she understood that this was not a love born of rescue, but of choice, of endurance, of trust. The ranch thrived under their care, but more than that, it became a sanctuary. Neighbors came to trade and found warmth in Mary's smile, steadiness in John's presence. Travelers passing through spoke of the ranch as a place where light lingered, where hope felt tangible. Mary knew then that her pain had not been wasted. It had been transformed into strength, into healing, into love that reached beyond her own heart and spilled into the land itself. As the seasons turned, their love continued to grow, not in grand declarations, but in the 1,000 quiet ways they chose each other every day. And when Mary finally smiled without sorrow pressing against her chest, it was a smile of both survival and promise. The ranch was no longer just her inheritance. It was their home, built not only from timber and soil, but from trust, devotion, and the healing grace of love. And now, dear listener, if this story has stirred something gentle within you, if it has reminded you that even in the harshest deserts of despair, love can bloom and hope can rise again, then let your heart linger with us a little longer. Like this story, leave a comment to share your thoughts and subscribe so that you may walk with us into the next tale. Your voice, your presence, your kindness here are part of the healing thread we weave together. Let love live in your words, and may it carry you gently through the nights to come.